Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest teaching session in the course on technology and the future of medicine. Today, Jack Tuszynski is going to tell us about biology on the threshold of quantum revolution. Take it away, Jack.
First of all, I would like to apologize for not being here a week ago. Malfunction of some kind, communications. Secondly, I will not apologize for what will happen in the next 1 hour, which is you'll be thrown out of your comfort zone, and for a good reason. I guess you are an avant-garde of this university student body, and you should be exposed to some challenging, provocative ideas. So I will do that. I have 3 objectives for you this afternoon. The first one is to review the basis of quantum mechanics. I'm not quite sure how many of you took quantum mechanics. I assume none. Am I right? Okay. With this background, we'll take a look at what quantum concepts may apply in biology. And that's the main title of the talk, the quantum revolution in biology that is actually taking place quietly to some and loudly to some others. And finally, which I think will be the most fun if we get to the end part of the talk, I'll expose you to some somewhat strange, maybe some say crazy ideas about the relevance of quantum physics to neuroscience, to how our brains work. So let's get going. How many of you, how many of you heard about this conference, Solvay conference in Brussels, Belgium, 1927. Okay. Well, what you see here is the greatest collection of human intellect on the planet that was ever assembled. On this picture, you'll see in the middle Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, Max Planck, Erwin Schrödinger, Paul Dirac, and many others. I have no time to list, but at least 20 Nobel Prizes in this one photo. And these people gathered together in Hotel Metropole in Brussels to discuss the foundations of modern science, physics, quantum physics. They met on several of these conferences and established the groundwork for what we are still trying to grapple with, the understanding of quantum physics, the nature of reality, the most fundamental concepts that human mind ever achieved. That led to many things, including modern technology, but I think there is a great belief and suspicion, optimism about the presence of quantum concepts and ideas in biology. We'll come to it later, but before we start talking about words that might describe it, I really want to give you something to think about, some ideas that may maybe shatter your concept of physical reality. So this is the basics, really basic of quantum mechanics. And since you, I presume, are not physicists, I'll try to describe it using some metaphor and descriptive language as much as possible. But in a nutshell, modern physics broke away from Newtonian concept of reality where particles have physical size, you can touch it, hardness. They have precise location. You can measure where they are. You can measure how fast they are moving and what sort of energy they may be carrying. This is still very relevant because without this we couldn't build buildings like this one. But if you look at the fundamental nature of reality, physics at the level of microscopic objects, elementary particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, etc., this doesn't apply at all. You have to change your perspective entirely and view these objects more or less like clouds. Well, I'll come to it in a second, but I will qualify my statement that this is relevant only to microscopic nature of reality with exceptions. There are many exceptions. In fact, some of these exceptions are known to us, and we deal with this on a daily basis, not even realizing that this has quantum character. And these macroscopic, as we say, macroscopic quantum phenomena include superfluids, superconductors, lasers. We have some around. Laser is a quantum device and operates at room temperature and operates at a microscopic scale. We even have laser weapons in development, so there's no doubt that they can do some serious damage to large objects. Also, as I will describe a bit later on, the dynamics of solid objects, such as crystals, can only be understood properly using quantum language. The same with electromagnetic waves. We call them photons in physics. Light is only a tiny spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, and that actually led to the discovery of quantum mechanics that I'll describe in a few minutes. Okay, so these gentlemen, and I believe one woman, Marie Curie, that were assembled in Brussels, they formulated the so-called principles of quantum mechanics. The mathematical foundation actually was developed in the 19th century prior to these discoveries, and it was very fortuitous that physicists in the early 20th century had already all the tools necessary to build a proper theory, namely the theory of Hilbert spaces, functional analysis, and Hermitian operators. Okay, so what is the basics of quantum mechanics? The first principle, which is very strange, is the wave-particle duality. That means that physical objects, such as elementary particles, have dual nature. They can be seen as particles, can be seen as waves at the same time, depending on how you measure it, what sort of tools you use to find their characteristics. And actually, the same applies to waves. Vice versa, waves can also have properties of particles, namely momentum and energy. The second difference from classical and between classical and quantum physics is the use of probability theory. In quantum mechanics, there is no certainty about anything. We have to forget about this. It's simply impossible to say anything with 100% certainty. Every object can only be described by a probability distribution function. That is, you can state that with 90% certainty, this electron is sitting there. But the remaining 10% is unknown. Could be anywhere else in the universe. Because these clouds that represent particles stretch to infinity. So it may be shocking, but that's the way it is. Unfortunately, or fortunately, because it's exciting, we have determined beyond the shadow of the doubt that that's the nature of reality as we know it. The third thing, which is kind of shocking, is that an observer may also mean another particle, cannot be excluded from an experiment. That is, when you do an experiment, you do an observation, you always interfere with the object that you want to measure. And that is part of the uncertainty, but it's not the whole story about it. And the fourth basic element in quantum theory actually is what it gave its name, quantization. Quantization means that there's discrete levels of energy. So it seems to us that energy is has some sort of spectrum, continuum spectrum, but in fact, in physics at this level, physical systems exist at discrete levels, and you can only transition from one state to the other by quantum of energy transitions. So quantum of energy, what is this? It's the lowest amount of energy that can be used, and below that there is no manifestation of it. One of the people that were in the photo was Werner Heisenberg, a young Werner Heisenberg who also got the Nobel Prize. And he came up with another, actually mathematical formulation of this weird nature of quantum reality, that there is an impossibility of simultaneously specifying two so-called complementary physical parameters at the same time. You cannot know at the same time where the particle is and how fast it's moving. And it's limited by, unfortunately, the choice of red and blue background is not very good. But basically it says that the product of the uncertainty of position and the uncertainty of momentum must always be greater than the Planck constant. This will actually come in this talk a few times, the Planck constant. So that's a fundamental constant. In other words, fundamental means it's not something that we humans invented. It actually existed in the universe before we even emerged as human beings. It's a fundamental in the sense of unchangeable, immutable, a property of the universe. And actually, Max Planck discovered it by accident in a way. By analyzing black body radiation, so at different temperature, you can characterize the intensity of radiation, electromagnetic waves, such as light, coming to us from the outer space or generated here. And there is a spectrum with probabilities. To make a long story short, using the theory of the time, nobody could explain it. There was simply no existing theory. Statistical mechanics, thermodynamics couldn't explain it. Max Planck was already a senior scientist at the age of only 42. And against his own convictions, he introduced two artificial constructs in order to explain the observations. The first one was that the energy of electromagnetic waves is proportional to frequency and some constant, which turned out to be the Planck constant. And the second is that the energy is quantized. It cannot be, as I said, a continuum of energies. It has to be steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., to infinity, blocks of energy, or packets of energy. It cannot be 1.5 or 2.5 or 1 1/3. That's basic quantization. So that was against his own conviction and physical intuition. Nobody had this intuition before Planck, and very few after Planck. Quantization is against human nature, but it's true. And so he explained this. This is the Planck's radiation law in all mathematical glory. And the Planck constant is stated there in numerical value, and that's a fundamental number. It is like pi, 3.1415, et cetera, et cetera. There is a specific number, and it doesn't change whether you measure it on the North Pole, on Mars, or wherever, or tomorrow, or a month from now. Okay, we'll come back to it because I'll propose something called the biological Planck constant in a few minutes. So that was the first experiment that shattered the world of physics and its explanation that earned, of course, Max Planck a Nobel Prize. And I mentioned he was 42 at the time. I'd throw a challenge at you. You're young people. I think you're about to enter into the world of medicine or science. I hope you'll make big discoveries. According to my research, Max Planck was the oldest person who ever made a major discovery at the age of 42. So be careful how you waste your time. Don't waste your time. Make your big discovery before the age of 40, or maybe 42. Einstein, actually, when he wrote his 5 fundamental papers in 1 year at the patent office in Bern, Switzerland, that shattered the world of physics also, he was 27. So, with no faculty position, barely passing a PhD exam a year before. Anyway, so these are, to me, feel-good stories, you know, that you can do it no matter where you are, and maybe not when that happens, but I would say up to a certain point. Okay, so the photoelectric effect is what Einstein explained and got a Nobel Prize for. I'm starting to sound like a broken record because everything I talk about ended up with Nobel Prize. Basically, what it explains is that light striking a metal surface, provided it has a high enough frequency, ejects electrons. And you can measure these electrons by measuring the current that will flow between 2 electrodes. In other words, and where is this quantization here? The quantization is that the energy of waves, light, must exceed the barrier that electrons need to overcome in order to start conducting. This was fundamental too, because it's a quantum amount of the barrier that has to be overcome, not any amount of energy. It has to be more, at least h nu greater than the so-called work function. All right. It's important. This example and the previous one, the black body radiation and the photoelectric effect, are very good examples, very important examples, because I claim that we are now witnessing, to some degree, a repeat of the same story that happened in physics, now in biology. And these two examples will come back to illustrate what's happening in biology in 21st century, what happened in physics in 20th century. There were some additional experiments that solidified the theory, Compton effect. So scattering between electrons and photons, that means that light and particles are one and the same. They collide, so light can collide with particles as if it was a particle. That's an important conceptual change. You probably don't think about light as a particle. Actually, Newton did. So there is a very interesting historical footnote to this. And other experiments, I will just mention the atomic emission spectra, because it turned out that atoms are built from nuclei and electrons circulating around the nuclei, but in orbits, just like the planetary system. So electrons can hop from orbit to orbit as if in some sort of similar fashion, planets could jump from orbit to orbit. But this is just a metaphor. Niels Bohr, another Nobel Prize winner from Copenhagen, came up with this explanation of atomic spectra. And finally, this so-called Stern-Gerlach experiment illustrated that elementary particles have a new property that hitherto nobody knew existed, namely spin. You can think about it as a spinning mass, and has its own angular momentum, as we call it in physics. And the spin is indispensable for magnetic properties of systems such as ferromagnets. And of course, ferromagnetism was known to ancients, in ancient Greece and India and so on. So this is another example of a quantum phenomenon that we all know and are familiar with. But it cannot and will not exist without a quantum component, namely spin. All right. I'm talking a lot. Time is passing. I'll just very quickly go through these postulates. It's basically, again, a major conceptual shift from our classical thinking, our intuitive thinking about matter. The first postulate of quantum mechanics is that every particle is represented by a wave function. It's not coordinates and masses. It's simply a mathematical function distributed in space. Take it or leave it. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. So again, think about it as a cloud. The clouds don't have really very firm shapes. They are spread out. They have different densities. You can think about particles the same way. And you can relate these wave functions to probabilities of finding them in different parts of space and at different points in time. So this is the second postulate of quantum mechanics, which relates the square of the wave function to the probability of finding it in a point in space time. The third postulate is really hard to swallow for anybody who is not trained in higher mathematics and advanced physics. It basically gives a prescription for how to do math, how to predict evolution of systems, replacing Newton's equations of motion. You probably heard about that, and some of you must have taken at least first year physics, and Newton's laws of physics, first, second, third. This replaces all of it, and replaces physical observables, physical quantities with mathematical operators acting on the wave function. And the equation that predicts the future of a particle is called the Schrödinger equation. And guess what? Schrödinger got a Nobel Prize for this. And you see it at the bottom. Basically, it's a prescription for how to calculate the energy of an object, of a physical object. Okay, and this is the 1926, a year after the Solvay conference that you saw. Erwin Schrödinger a year before the Solvay conference, he proposed this equation, which replaces actually Newton's second law, Newton's equation of motion. And I might add a historical anecdote that he discovered or put together this equation over a 2-week holiday in the Swiss Alps. So sometimes it's good to take time off and take a notebook with you. Maybe you'll discover something big. And he did. OK, so now this is the end of my introductory expose about quantum mechanics. I hope you at least get some sort of an intuitive feel for it. I am not expecting you to solve any equations, but at least you know which names to look up in Wikipedia if you want to do that. All right, so how do we link it to biology? It seems to be pretty arcane, far out, scary stuff. Well, it's all matter, right? Living or non-living, it's all composed of the same elements, the same elementary particles, the same players, arranged differently. Why should life be different from non-living forms? So this is kind of a reductionist point of view where organisms can be described by organs, organs by cells, cells by structures inside cells, including proteins. Proteins are encoded by DNA. DNA are composed of nucleotides, and nucleotides are composed of atoms. What's the big deal? Of course, there is a big deal. And that's why it took a century to even think about it properly. But the first observation is that we're not that smart, right, as a human race. We have to admit it. Maybe we can boast, but honestly, I mean, we're pretty stupid. Nature has had 2 billion of years. We had, what, 100,000, maybe 10,000 years of civilization. Nature has had 2 billion years to experiment, and nature has been performing experiments simultaneously, nonstop on this planet. And we have a bunch of scientists gathering in Solvay in 1927 and discovering quantum mechanics. I mean, how naive would it be to expect that nature, in 2 billion years and trillions upon trillions of experiments, has not found a way to use quantum mechanics? And we use quantum mechanics for lasers, for magnets, for superconductors, etc. So that's kind of an argument that I think is based on common sense. The complication is this, that it's not only elements, elementary particles, and elements and molecules, it's also how they interact. It's not just the Lego blocks, but their interactions and the rules of the game. So this shows you that at least the way we view science, science is organized in manifolds or planes of play. We call them branches of science. So you have the elementary particle physics, you have the condensed matter physics, chemistry, biochemistry, cell biology, organismic biology, blah, 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 physiology. And within each of these planes, you have more or less the same players organized differently, but interactions that you study are different. For example, in elementary particle physics, you really dig the deepest, but you have probably the fewest numbers of players and not very diverse. If you move up this ladder, you'll see in biochemistry, you don't care about quarks and gluons and anything else. These interactions don't play any role. You only care about nucleotides and amino acids and their, covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds and things like that. So we really haven't integrated science vertically like that, so we don't know how these fit together, and a logical argument for the use of quantum mechanics in biology is a very weak one, because we simply have not been able to make these connections. If you look at the dimensions of matter, I don't know why there's 2 matters, I'm sorry. Then you see also a complication, namely quantum concepts are applicable to the bottom scale again, atoms and molecules, quantum chemistry. It took about 30 to 40 years for chemistry to develop a branch of itself called quantum chemistry. So it was first quantum physics. Now quantum chemistry is very respectable. It's really well built, understood, and explains chemical bonds and how different atoms come together to form molecules. Now, the next level is biochemistry and biology. I would call it mesoscale. At the cell biology level, you have biochemical molecules coming together and forming larger structures. This is challenging our computational abilities, but it's not completely out of scope. What's interesting and reassuring, in fact, is that in biology, at the level of cell biology at least, you have the energy scales and chemical affinity scales. Energy and the kinetics of chemical reactions are actually intimately related. It shows you at the top. So from the rates of reactions, you can figure out how strong the bonds are that make these reactions, made in these reactions. So this is the list of the chemical energy scales, and I want to draw your attention only to two. The first one is thermal noise. All biology occurs roughly at room temperature, physiological temperature, high at 20 degrees to 40 degrees Celsius. Above 40 degrees, proteins denature. We couldn't live about 40 degrees. Below 20 degrees, we shiver. You have hypothermia. It's problematic. Of course, there are organisms that can deal with this to some degree, but by and large, it's a very narrow range of temperatures that we can tolerate. And this temperature is related to energy, so-called thermal energy, KT, which is abundant, for free. If you're in this room, you get free heat from the surroundings. So this KT is kind of at the lowest level at which you really bother about energy, because anything smaller than that is noise. And then the other level is biochemical energy. And it's interesting because biochemical energy has a currency. It has a quantum, the quantum of ATP or GTP, but typically ATP in most chemical reactions, biochemical reactions. Everything that our body requires, all the machinery, motor proteins, enzymes, consume ATP. It's the molecule, adenosine triphosphate, that is produced by mitochondria and distributed throughout. It's a quantum of biological energy. You can really say that. And that's the value over here. You can't read. In physical units, it's 10 to the minus 20th joule. Easy to remember, minus 20th. Very small, but meaningful. And it's about 10 times greater than noise. So it's not really from nowhere. You have to make it. Okay. So now we have a little bit of a link, a tenuous link between quantum and biology through energy. We'll make it deeper. If you go to Wikipedia and you try to find quantum biology, you'll find that most of the discussions currently in science about quantum biology refer to exotic phenomena that quantum mechanics brings to the table. And these are I'm going to say a few words about each because it's important. And actually, the most interesting manifestation of some of that may be found in neuroscience. Maybe you can relate to that. So superposition. Superposition principle basically is one of the fundamental properties of quantum systems. And you may have heard about the Schrödinger cat. Have you heard this? So quantum particles can be both here and there, can have a spin up and down at the same time. We don't have that in microscopic world, right? We don't think about that like that. So the Schrödinger cat may be both dead and alive. Until and unless you make a test and force the system to tell you what it is, you have to assume a superposition. That's called the superposition principle. Why is it important? Because it's an incredibly useful property to have. You can actually inspect large spaces by using superposition. Rather than do linearly, is this black or is this white? Is this red or is this green? And so on. If you have a superposition, you allow the entire space of possibilities to coexist at the same time. Our mental states may be in superposition. You may be listening to me right now and at the same time thinking about your date tonight. Things of this nature. So maybe that'll allow you to understand superposition in a better way. Another is non-locality, similar. That is, particles which are far away, in fact, maybe infinitely away, they are connected. So this is a strange property of quantum systems. And entanglement, so that's another thing where two properties of quantum systems may be connected in spite of not being physically at the same place. And this, the last one, tunneling, is kind of like a ghost in a way. Quantum particles may penetrate through obstacles that classical particles cannot. Because it's a wave function, it's a cloud, it doesn't have to be bouncing off the wall like a tennis ball. It can simply penetrate through it. And there will be some finite probability, although small, that your particle is on the other side of the wall. If this is not shocking, I don't know what is. But it's all allowed in physics and tested. So tunneling allows, and maybe even, and I don't want to go into really speculative stuff and parapsychology and things like that, but if you were to come up with rational explanations of some things like predicting the future, paranormal phenomena, premonitions, tunneling would be my bet. That you can tunnel through physical spaces and obstacles by using quantum states. There is a very interesting book called The Dreaming Universe by the author is Wolf, I forget his first name. You can look it up. There's a whole list of doubting Thomases about quantum mechanics in biology and various arguments stating that it cannot be done and because of the fact that life is at high temperature. Most of quantum physics suffers from heat. You can destroy quantum phenomena by heating systems too much, but there are some ways of overcoming this. Biology requires hydration. Water is indispensable for life. Wet systems are typically very difficult to trick into quantum phenomena because of the interactions with water molecules. And life systems are slow compared to physical quantum systems. So the time scales are much slower than what happens in physics. But I'll come to this, hopefully, in the last part of the talk when we talk about quantum brain dynamics and how brain may be actually operating at various time scales at the same time. And last but not least, I think biological systems are very complex. Their arrangements is incredibly complicated, and most of physical systems are very regular. So people say, well, you know, it's next to impossible to calculate this because it's so complex and it's very difficult, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, given time, maybe we'll be able to deal with this. At the same time, quantum mechanics allows us to at least propose some explanations for a number of strange and difficult properties of living systems, one of which, and again, you can't, is the collective dynamics within living systems. That is, we have a sense of integrity or some sort of, maybe not, that's not the right word, not in the sense of psychological integrity, but a large organism like the human body or a single cell composed of many parts operates in synchrony, is correlated internally, and doesn't require any instructions to do that. So it's very difficult to come up with a mechanistic explanation how all these pieces fit together like it's in a Swiss watch and work perfectly without this set of instructions. That's one of the unsolved mysteries. Another thing that I want to mention is life requires energy input, constant energy input. So this is what we call in physics far from equilibrium, far from thermodynamic equilibrium. A thermodynamic equilibrium means death, basically, in one word. So you have to pump the system with energy, And we don't really have very good physical theories for that. And that may be one of the weaknesses of quantum mechanics, because it really is not very easy to integrate quantum mechanics with external non-equilibrium pumping. Finally, related to it, living systems are open. So we are open to information, we are open to energy flows, and of course temperature, heat. So again, that makes physical applications very difficult. I just want to say very briefly that the history of explorations of physicists and biology, especially quantum physicists, is very long. It goes back to Schrödinger, of the famous Schrödinger equation, who actually wrote a beautiful book that I encourage you to read. It was called What is Life? A Nobel Prize-winning physicist wrote in 1944, I believe, at the end of the Second World War, this book, which is a manifesto of what is puzzling in biology and what physics, even physics, has difficulty grappling with. Some of these puzzles have been solved by DNA, for example, information in DNA, and some others are still open. I'll pass through the rest in the interest of time. One more observation is that today, in 21st century, we also have incredible technology at our disposal that allows us to have a great glimpse into living systems and make observations and probably come up with much better theories. This includes things like scanning tunneling microscopy, atomic force microscopy, laser spectroscopy, and so on. I'll skip that as well. Okay, and now we're coming to the use of technology guiding us to demonstrate that biology at the very bottom of its foundation is quantum in nature. So now we've moved almost a century forward. In about 2007-8, there were a number of experiments published in Science and Nature focusing on photosynthesis as a quantum mechanical phenomenon. If you remember what I said in the beginning, about a century ago, more than a century ago, physics was revolutionized as a result of 4 or 5 experiments, and then came some giants of intellect like Einstein and Planck and Schrödinger, who explained these experiments by bringing in new concepts. The same is gradually happening, I think, in biology. The first experiment that is a bit like the photoelectric effect. Remember photoelectric effect? Einstein got a Nobel Prize for it. Light striking a metal plate, ejecting electrons, and they measured the conductivity. Photosynthesis is very similar, except instead of the metal plate, you have the chlorophyll of a plant. Light being absorbed by the chlorophyll and transformed into energy. How does that happen? Well, these experiments of the last 5-6 years demonstrate that this happens by quantum tunneling processes. Absorption of light triggers a chain of reactions which in the end release electrons from CO2. And these electrons are then used to make work, and in fact are captured to produce ATP, the quantum of biochemical energy. So in a way, in a strange way, it's all very reminiscent of the photoelectric effect. This was done also in bacteria, thermophilic bacteria from New Zealand, FMO. The FMO complex is a biochemical complex that actually does this capturing work and transfer of electrons. There is detailed information available about the structural arrangement of this complex, and the bottom line is you need 7 of these aromatic groups in a proper arrangement. This was actually studied through experiments and computational simulations, and demonstrated without a doubt that light ejects electrons from these complexes, which these electrons hop from one complex to the next, and then end up being captured and performing useful work in the creation of ATP. So there's, I don't want to get into the mathematical detail, but just give you a glimpse. This is very well characterized by the so-called Hamiltonian. Remember, one of the postulates of quantum mechanics. Hamiltonian replaces the energy. It's a function or operator of energy. So now we have a Hamiltonian, a quantum Hamiltonian, for a photosynthetic complex. So plants, one more thing I want to emphasize. Maybe I'm talking too fast. I said something that I think is fundamental. Life is a non-equilibrium process. That means life cannot be sustained without energy input, right? Energy. Where is energy coming from? In plants, from light. Yeah? Photosynthesis is a fundamental way of harvesting energy and transforming this into biological function in plants. In animals, this is not the way energy is transduced. Energy is produced typically from glucose in mitochondria to make the same end product, ATP. We'll come to this in a second. So this is a hypothesis now I'm making, that if plants use quantum mechanics and they are less evolved than animals, undoubtedly I would say, for many, many reasons. We have no time to list all of these, but you would agree that plants are less evolved than animals. And plants are demonstrated now scientifically to harness energy by quantum mechanics processes. Would you be surprised to know that animals also use quantum mechanics to make energy? I wouldn't. So these papers, 2007, show using lasers shining on these FMO complexes how electronic coherence was demonstrated. This is through beating and measured in a detection device. So it's really hardcore quantum physics at work. I'm now switching gears to animals. Animal cells are constructed differently. They use energy differently. One thing that is different in animal cells, well, maybe not so much, but in addition to energy, microtubules are tubulin or protein polymers which perform cell division. Cell division is another key process. There is no life without cell division, right? I mean, this is one of the definitions of life. Life is non-equilibrium. Life is, by definition, promoting life or producing new cells. Microtubules are instrumental in cell division, making mitotic spindles. We now know the structure of the building blocks of microtubules, tubulin. I will just go a little bit into this to show you what's important about it. They are made from this protein into cylinders, and it's not very clear, unfortunately, but when you look at the surface of a microtubule, there's one very important amino acid, tryptophan. Tryptophan absorbs light and can be used in this energy transduction, very much the same like in chlorophyll. So here we showed the organization of tryptophans in the tubulin of a microtubule. So the hypothesis is that this is still not experimentally documented, but I'm just making a hypothesis based on structural similarity that microtubules may process quantum energy in a quantum fashion in all animal cells, including neurons in our brain. Microtubules actually have the highest concentration in the brain, in neurons. We'll come to this in a minute. I have 10 minutes left, so I should be able to do that. I'll just give you one more thing about energy, and then we'll switch to the brain. So energy transduction, as I said, is critical to all living forms, right? And so we have energy transducing networks in plants, chloroplasts, And then we have bacteria membranes and enzymes in bacteria that produce energy. And then we have energy transducing networks, mitochondria in animal cells. And mitochondria, all of these things involve complex enzymes which operate cyclically. They produce proton transfer and electron transfer reactions, all of which are quantum chemical, by the way. And there is a characteristic time, turnover time. So now this is a critical moment. I need to dig deep into your, your encyclopedic knowledge. Okay, so what? All of these enzymes work as oscillators. An oscillator is a canonical example in physics of something which is similar on all scales. A pendulum is an oscillator because it goes back and forth, right? These enzymes are kind of biological pendula. They go back and forth, back and forth. And now I'm going to make a quantum leap, pun intended, into something that has been known in physiology for almost a century and not connected to this quantum thing. It's called metabolic scaling laws of physiology. Kleiber in France formalized it in 1940, but it goes back to Lavoisier, Laplace in 1780. In other words, if you look at the energy requirement of a living system, and you think that if somebody is twice as big as somebody else, you would expect the energy requirement to increase twice, right? Twice as much. No, it doesn't work this way. And these people that are listed here, Lavoisier, Laplace, Rubner, and Kleiber, over the centuries, in fact, analyzed the energy requirement of organisms from bacteria to elephants. And there's a universal scaling law, basically saying that when you double the size of an organism, the requirement on energy, metabolic energy requirement, increases with the power 3/4. Not linear, but 0.75, roughly. Nobody knows why. It's strange. Okay, so in the next slide, I'm going to try and explain it, maybe a few slides. But if you accept quantum principles, that these oscillators synchronize, you'll be able to explain this. And these enzymatic oscillators are required to transduce energy in humans from glucose to ATP, in bacteria from light to ATP, or plants. So it's very common. You introduce a quantization principle, just like Max Planck did for enzymatic oscillators. The frequency of the oscillator is related to energy rate. And I also want to mention one more thing. There was one more Nobel Prize that I missed to list by Paul Debye. Paul Debye explained the specific heat of solids in 1936, I believe, maybe 33, by observing that solids are not a collection of independent atoms just vibrating randomly, but forming waves, like the ocean wave. A crystal could be thought of as masses that vibrate in unison. And Einstein made a mistake. He made only one mistake. He assumed that a solid is made up of atoms that oscillate independently. That was kind of stupid, right? Because you know that crystals are tightly connected atoms. So anyway, and this is the outcome of Debye's correct calculation, scaling law for specific heat as a function of temperature. And Einstein failed, didn't get a Nobel Prize for this, but Debye did. So if you assume, I'll skip it. This is the so-called Debye model of solids. Lloyd Demetrius from Harvard basically translated this model of solids into the metabolic networks of living systems, made an analogy between solids and cells, and these enzymes being like these little atoms oscillating, and did the math, and lo and behold, you can explain metabolism in quantum terms. and you come up with quantum metabolism and get the proper scaling law for all species, from bacteria to elephants. This is the bit of math that is required for it. A bit more math again. A few integrals here and there, no big deal, trust me. And at the end of the day, you get this formula, which is P is the basic metabolic rate, W is the weight of an organism, and D is dimension in space. So if you, for some reason, had a one-dimensional organism, a linear organism, the scaling law for linear organisms would be 1/2, square root of mass. If you had a two-dimensional, a planar organism, it would be 2/3. If it's a three-dimensional organism, 3/4. Right? D, 3 over D plus 1, 3/4. Agrees perfectly with several of these examples. I made a mental shortcut telling you that from bacteria to elephants, but there are some subclasses and they correlate with dimensionality. Okay. I will, by the way, if you want, I will post these PowerPoint slides for you so you can maybe study some of this because we really have no time. Last year, somebody commented on it that this is a 1-hour talk that should be a 1-semester course. Maybe it is. But I want to leave you with something actually quite exciting. Here, this slide summarizes all of this about metabolism, and I remember that I said you make an assumption the same way Max Planck did in 1901 for biological systems, and I call it biological Planck constant. You end up with a number which is different from the physical Planck constant by 11 orders of magnitude, which, by the way, scales properly to the number of atoms each mitochondrion has in a cell. And there is a few thousand mitochondria in every cell. I'm a physicist pretending to be a biologist, by the way. I know a little bit of biology, but not that much. Okay, so I'm going to leave you in the next maybe 5 minutes with something really that I think is exciting, where quantum phenomena really make a big difference. In metabolism, we are searching for a needle in a haystack. In cognition, in neuroscience, we are probably looking at it. Maybe it's staring at us in our face. Quantum phenomena. Because really we don't know how the brain works. We think we do, but we don't really. I'll tell you why. So this is the paper that just been published by Anirban Bandyopadhyay from Tsukuba in Japan, now at MIT, postulating a fractal quantum model of the brain. I'll try to explain in a few minutes what that means. So it, of course, begs a lot of questions, big questions. What is consciousness? What is memory even? We don't know what memory is. Where is it stored? In the brain. How is it processed? How is information processed? So there's several competing theories. Classical processing. Our brain is a computer. In one slide, I'll show it's not. Is it quantum? It's something different. Is it fractal quantum? Maybe. What's the computational power of the brain? And there are some estimates, some big numbers. We have 100 billion neurons, each of which is connected to about 10,000 other neurons through synapses. So it's about 10,000 synapses on average. So if you do some very crude calculation, switching times on a millisecond scale, you get 10 to the 18th operations per second for the brain. This is classical. If the brain is classical, this is roughly our processing speed, 10 to the 18th per second. But if you do actually a bit more investigations, you go inside the neuron. To me, neuron is not a switch. Neuron is a cell. It's an intelligent, maybe supercomputer. I call it a supercomputer at least. And if you go deeper into what's happening in the neuron, you can make corrections to these calculations and find some proteins that can actually do the binary operations. You do the calculation and end up with 10 to the 27th operations per brain. So it's 11 orders of magnitude, 100 billion times more, which actually challenges currently available technology. If we trust the second estimate, which gives more credit to the brain, then our brain, on average, is much more powerful than the most powerful supercomputer on the planet. On top of that, we use very little energy to do these calculations, these computations. So, power consumption of the brain. We use 25 watts. It's less than a single bulb to power the brain, to do so many computations. Currently, the most advanced supercomputer project on the planet, the Blue Brain project, or the Human Brain project, actually, in Lausanne, Switzerland, was awarded 1.3 billion euros for 10 years to construct 1 million neurons only. Remember, we have 100 billion. And they will construct 1 million at the cost of 10 terawatts of power, which is almost, 100 milliwatts for 1 million. If you scale it up, if you wanted to simulate the entire brain, this would take the entire power generated by the planet to power one artificial brain. Okay, that to me is wow. One bulb is what we have, and we do this calculation. If you want to simulate by current technology, you would need to use all the power generated on the entire planet to power one brain, artificial brain. To me, that signals a big problem, that our understanding of the brain is completely wrong. So there are several artificial brain projects currently underway, one in Switzerland, one in the US, and there is also one in Japan. The root cause of the problem is in our understanding, or lack thereof, of consciousness. Is our brain producing consciousness, or is consciousness producing our brain? Don't laugh. There are some serious people thinking that matter is created by consciousness, not the other way around. But I'm not venturing into this territory. I'm actually interested in correlates of consciousness. Cognition, how you affect perception. And you can study this with pharmacological agents. For example, anesthetics. If you go under anesthesia, your consciousness disappears like this. It's only as a result of some tiny molecules. How can this be? I spent some time trying to understand memory, and there are also very, very competing theories of memory. Where is memory stored? How is it stored? Some people think it's holographic memory in our brain. There's some kind of image, inverted image. There were experiments demonstrating actually that memory can be switched off by pharmacological agents in mice. Okay, we cannot experiment on humans right now with this sort of intervention. But it turned out that the agents that switch off memory in mice inhibit enzymes called calmodulin kinase 2. And these enzymes, what they do actually is phosphorylate microtubules. Remember microtubules? I showed you microtubules in dividing cells. They also pack densely in neurons. So we made a postulate that memory is actually encoded by phosphate groups on the surface of microtubules in special locations. And if you take this into account seriously, and we have an animal model demonstrating it, then you end up with a humongous power of the brain and humongous memory storage in the brain. Just as a sort of anecdotal aside, you may have heard about near-death experiences. You read about this? When people go through the tunnel and they recall their life events, to every single event is encoded. The current models of memory do not allow for this. There is no room in the brain to store every event in your life. This model allows you to do that. If you do the calculation, you have an enormous amount of memory you can store in your brain by encoding it in special protein locations, easily enough to encode all your life's history. So now, actually in Vancouver, there's a company called D-Wave, which produced the first quantum computer. So if we can, again, to this argument to our primitive intellect compared to the evolutionary history of the planet, if we can construct a quantum computer after 10,000 years on the planet, I would be surprised, really, if our brain wasn't using this technology. And again, why is it useful? Because quantum information search is much faster than classical. Classical will be, if you're looking for an ace of spades in the deck of cards, you turn over every card and you look for the ace of spades. Quantum algorithm allows you to project a wave function that spreads everywhere at the same time. And in terms of the speed up of quantum versus classical searches, classical scale with the number of objects you search, and quantum square root of the number. So if you have 10,000 objects to search through, to the quantum computer is like searching 100 only. And the bigger the set, the greater the difference. That's why it makes a lot of sense to use quantum computation in the context of neuroscience. I will finish with this slide, just to charge your imagination with something which I find is very fascinating. So this is a very busy slide in this paper by Anirban that just came out. It talks about a fractal resonant model. The brain is very hierarchical. If you look inside the neuron, you have very elaborate structure of protein filaments. Neurons are organized in a very special way as well. So this model says that at deeper levels, at the deepest levels of the brain, you have the fastest processes taking place, and these feed into the next level, which are a bit slower. After initial searches, then you increase the size of the search, but you slow down the processes or decrease the frequency. And you can actually span this by 30 orders of magnitude, where femtosecond processes, 10 to the minus 15th, occur at the level of atoms. And the human life is on the order of 10 to the 15th. So we spend 30 orders of magnitude. If you record life history, that's 10 to the minus 15th frequency. Okay, maybe it's too much. I'm sure it was too much, but I told you, I'm not apologetic. You're young, you can absorb it all. Thank you very much.
I just have a question for you about the simulation of brain systems using computers. So there was a slide about the fact that they're doing it in Japan, and they have a couple in planning. So I'm not a neuroscientist, but how can you, like, while you might have a computer that can simulate the amount of connections, how can you like be modifying the pathways of those connections? Because the brain is very specific in which neurons, talk to which neurons. So if you have just how does that work?
Yeah. It's a good question. Actually, it's a very good, profound question, because we know from various studies that although there are regions of the brain responsible for various functions, for visual processing, for audio processing, and so on, when there were people with various injuries of the brain injuries, then some other regions of the brain take over. Of course, visual may be a very extreme example, but there are examples where you can actually see the takeover of some functions by different parts of the brain. But we're talking about very large areas. So the Human Brain Project in Switzerland initially wanted to replace each neuron by one computer. But you would need 100 billion computers. We don't have that many on the planet. So they decided to represent 10 million neurons by one computer. And to me, this is very naive, but of course the best we can do. And even that is better than what we have today. This project actually takes into account the different locations, so represents functional domains in the brain, and operating at some sort of synchrony and with a particular function. I don't know if this answers your question. Maybe somewhat, maybe to some degree.
Yeah, it does answer my question. So basically, they would have 10 million neurons represented by one computer, and then just see how that being activated responds with the other ones.
And this region interacts with another region, maybe visual processing, it talks to audio processing. You synchronize the two, because when I see you and I can talk at the same time, I've integrated two different inputs, right? I've integrated the visual processing, and sometimes when you watch on YouTube or somewhere something is out of sync, and you see the lips moving and the voice is different, I get very upset when I see that, right? So we do it automatically without thinking, right? Obviously, these regions talk to each other, and many other as well. You can walk and talk, you can eat and walk and talk, and you can do many other things at the same time. So obviously, there is some autonomy of the regions. There's also some synchronization taking place in the brain. And how can this be done? Of course, it's a great mystery. And I think if we think in terms of quantum concepts, where there's delocalization, everything is spread out. Remember the particles being spread everywhere? Now, states are spread out. So this part of the brain knows what this part is experiencing. Maybe not 100% the same way, but it is aware of it. So quantum wave function introduces an idea that I think is very relevant to neuroscience. Second question.
So the question I had, I guess, was for a lot of these experiments, I guess we just had to assume that these things took place, and obviously they came up with these values and whatnot. But so when you were discussing that our brain uses 25 watts, could you just spread some light as to where we came up with this value?
Okay.
Since I'm not versed in this.
Yes. Oh, well, that's quite actually. In general, it's not too difficult. Bioenergetics is a very mature field, and it has studied energy consumption of humans and other organs for a long time. You can do it by measuring calories, right, and dividing by the time it takes to replenish your nutritional input. So you can divide calories by time, then you get the power consumption. So let's say 2,000 calories a day. You change calories into joules, 4.2 times 4.2, it's actually kilocalories. What you call a calorie is a kilocalorie. So it's, you know the difference or not. Okay. When you read a label on a product which says 100 calories, it's actually 100,000 calories in physical units, thermodynamic units, right? It's an abbreviation. So it's 100,000 calories. 1 calorie is 4.2 joules. Okay, you do the math, and then if you consume on average 2,000 calories a day, 2,000 calories, so 2 million calories, so it's 8.4 million joules. You divide it by 24 hours, an hour is 3,600 seconds. You do the math, you end up with 100 watts. 100 joules per second is the energy consumption for the whole body, right? I don't know how experimental they determined that the brain uses, but the brain uses about 20 to 25% of the energy requirement of the whole body. Then you end up with 5 watts. So it's pretty easy. To get the order of magnitude is very easy. I mean, I would have estimated maybe the brain, you look at the mass of the brain, right, compared to the body, actually it's very small. So it consumes much more energy than any other organ. But it performs the most important functions. Of course, every organ is important, but without the brain, sorry. So that's how it goes. It's 25 watts. It's not a lot. And when you think about the amount of information processing that's going on, all at the same time, I think it's amazing. You compare it to your computer or to a supercomputer that pales in comparison to it. That to me is a mystery.
Okay, so that paper that you just put up is really interesting and very complicated. I'm wondering, what exactly frequency fractals are and why they're looking at proteins, tubulin.
Right. So first of all, I owe you an explanation of what a fractal is, right? And then we'll go into how fractals can. Fractal is actually maybe not a very precise statement in this connection. It should be self-similar objects. Fractal is, I'll give you an example of a fractal. A fractal would be any object which has branches, like a tree with lots of branches. So if you were to take just one branch of a tree, first of all, look at the tree and all the branches. Okay, you see the branching. Then you take one branch and you magnify it. It will look like a tree, roughly, because it also has branches from branches. And you take a small branch and you magnify it. So that's a fractal. But this is not a perfect fractal because it only looks like, but it's not exactly the same, right? So that's why it's called a self-similar object. It's similar, it's not identical, right? But there are some mathematical objects which you can actually make exactly the same when you change the scale. You take a part, magnify it, it's the same as the whole object to begin with, right? And then you take a smaller part, you magnify it, it looks the same as the one bigger from it. So why is it important and interesting? Because the brain is a bit like that. First of all, it has structurally, parts of the brain look like the whole brain, or it has a lot of branching. Then we know that this, I mentioned to you, that sometimes when brain injuries occur, functions are taken over. And when you look at the neuron is also, the nerve cell, neuron, has also a lot of branches, just like the whole architecture of the brain. So that's the self-similarity. And even, of course, there exist single-cell organisms which have some intelligence. Single paramecium, they exist, they swim, they look for food, they perceive the environment, they mate, and so on. So a single cell is already an intelligent object, and the brain is a super intelligent object, right? So there is some sort of self-similarity. Of course, the more complex, the bigger, the more connections, the more powerful it is. But it's this concept of self-similarity that Anirban has exploited in his model of the brain as a fractal object where processing is taking place at all levels. At the deepest level is very fast processing, maybe even faster than we can possibly understand or feel. We have a lot of processing going on, subliminal, right? There were experiments in psychology decades ago where people inserted images in a movie. Nobody noticed there were some images, but the subject, those studied in the room who were watching, they register that without understanding or realizing it subconsciously, So there is visual input which is going on. It's faster than we can possibly recognize. That's part of it. And where is it? Because since I don't know, I saw something in the movie. I didn't register that, but it propelled me to do something, to buy this Campbell soup or whatever it was, right? It's being used for various purposes. So maybe faster processing is at the lower level and slower processing at this mundane level. The same with body language, I don't know if you read some of these popular books about how we perceive the first 60 seconds, we make a decision without even realizing whether I like you or not. Right? Some of it is body language, which is subliminal. You don't know that you're making some sort of impression, but the brain recognizes it. Where is this? So some of it is built into that. To me, the most interesting aspect, so the fractal thing, that you build structures within structures within structures. The most interesting thing is actual integration of fast and slow. There's actually a book by a Nobel Prize in Economics, Kanahan, called Fast and Slow Thinking. So we do this, at least at two levels. We think fast and we think slow. Some of it is subconscious, right? Some of this, I told you today about the fractal something, brain. And you will forget tomorrow, and then a year from now, he said that, you know, I understand now. So there is this going on as well. Another thing is, of course, pattern recognition. I don't know, facial recognition, CAPTCHA, you know, in the internet. The machine cannot recognize these letters when they are jumbled up. We look at it and we recognize it. We can recognize words which are completely jumbled up as long as the first and the last letter is the same, is the correct one, right? Then you see the meaning. So there is a lot of incredible power going on in our brain, and we really have no clue. It definitely is not, I would say, 100% is not linear processor, you know, going through the matrix and building this somewhere there. I think it's, we do simultaneously a lot of things, and that's really how quantum mechanics operates. We explore the whole phase space of the wave function. Whether it's quantum, let's put it this way. It may be a metaphor. It may be something deeper than that.
So, you know, this is one of these teaching sessions that we'd like to go on forever, but unfortunately has to finish in 2 minutes. I wanted, and this is probably predictable, to comment on your idea that no important discoveries have been made by anybody older than age 42. I think a lot of it has to do with the limits of what you think is possible, and so therefore it's the feeling inside of being younger than 42 rather than the biological age of 42. So I think in the future there can be important discoveries made by people who have a physical age older than 42.
I hope so.
But they'll be youthful inside. That's what I think. Yeah.
I have my own theory, but maybe I'll say it off camera.
Okay. Thank you very, very much for an outstanding session.